Well, our guest is Yaya Moussa, who is the founder and president of Africa Today TV, Africa Prime. He's currently a resident of Washington, D.C. in the United States, but we'll be discussing a series of papers that he's written about how important it is to reset and reshape the relationship between the United States and Africa. Yeah, delighted you could join me. Could I ask you first, it's basically how did we get here in terms of relations between different African countries, the United States and Europe? You talk about the triangulation, that the old colonial powers were keen to keep their claws, if you like, on relations with former colonies. And the United States kind of let them have their way. Is that how you read the way it's developed historically?
I think there are many factors, particularly historical factors, which may explain this situation. Don't forget the fact that roughly African countries acceded to independence around 1960. There are exceptions, of course. Angola, 1975, Zimbabwe, 1980, Ghana, 1957, roughly 1960. Before that, Africa per se did not exist on the international scene. They were colonies of European powers, specifically of France, UK, and Portugal. And the US itself was very busy, so to speak, at home, dealing with social problems, namely segregation. So it was very difficult for the United States, on the one hand, to pretend defending African countries, while on the other hand, dealing with its own domestic issues with the black community. So this is one explanation. I think the US deliberately refrained from interfering in African matters for that particular reason. Secondly, you have the Cold War and the division of the world between two blocks, ideological blocks, East and West. And from that standpoint, I believe the United States decided to leave African matters to the former masters of African countries, namely the European powers. This can be explained by, pure rational decisions. Segregation of duties. The US may say, they have some African know-how. Let's leave it to the former colonial powers to handle Africa in the name of a broader West, while we, America, are dealing with Russia, Soviet Union at that time, and the Eastern Bloc. I think these are two critical factors. To sum up, Africans' own situation as, a bunch of colonies, the United States' domestic issues with its own black community, and the segregation of duties among powers in the context of the Cold War. So the United States showed a kind of benign neglect vis-à-vis Africa. Africa was not a top priority. There were other theaters of operation. Mention the Eastern Bloc. I can also talk about the Middle East. So that's the historical background. But as you rightly pointed out, the times have changed. Today, the geopolitical global landscape is shifting. Russia, China are making inroads in Africa. Africa plays a significant role on the world stage from different angles. We can elaborate on that later, economically, diplomatically, geopolitically, militarily, you name it. And the former colonial powers can no longer play that agency role I mentioned earlier, namely handling Africa in the name of the broader West. Look at what is happening today in French-speaking Africa. One country after the other. All the countries are now asking France to leave, the French military to leave the country. So there is a very deep crisis, confidence crisis, between Africa and its former colonial masters. If the United States want to play a significant global role, it has to jump in and deal directly with Africa.
I absolutely get your analysis here that there's Europe fatigue with the old colonial powers. But do you sense that in Washington, in DC, there is a will, a genuine will, to come in and play that role of a really active, engaged partner, which, as you rightly say, the United States has been reluctant to do hitherto?
Okay. The justification and then a straight answer to a question. I said the US has no choice but jump and play a direct role in Africa because of that fatigue. Africans are feeling a little bit frustrated by the former European colonial masters, and the geopolitical landscape is shifting, and now they have more options. Africans have more options with Russia and China coming in and competing with the West. So that's one thing. That's a broader context background. Regarding the US will, my answer is yes. There is a clear will for the US to play a bigger and more significant role in Africa, as stated in a recent paper by the Biden administration dating, I think, August 22nd, 2022. That was yesterday, precisely fleshing out the new US vision and strategy vis-à-vis the continent of Africa. And I think the paper very well encapsulates the new start in the relationship between the US and Africa. Allow me to mention 4 key features of that new strategy. First of all, taking stock of the fact that both Africa and US were jointly underachieving, comparing the achievements, the results, with the potential. So they needed really to start anew. The paper has 4 key features. The US would like to promote democracy and openness in Africa. The US would like to help Africa recover from the recent pandemic of COVID and also prevent future pandemics in Africa. The US would like to cooperate with Africa to exploit to its fullest extent the business and economic potential between US and Africa. And also the United States would like to promote the idea of environment conservation, climate change, protection of the nature, and energy transition. These are the 4 key dimensions of the new US-Africa strategy as spelled out by Anthony Blinken in August 2022. So definitely there is a will, and as people say, where there's a will, there's a way. So I am optimistic. This is definitely marking a new start in the US-Africa relation. Let me stress one thing. I think awareness is very important. And the highest US authorities themselves have recognized the fact that something needed to be done. That's very important. Realizing that Africa and US were jointly underperforming, underachieving. So my short answer now to your question is yes, there is a will. Beyond the will, there is a clear political agenda on how to strengthen the relationship between the United States and the continent of Africa.
Well, I quite understand that we could be at a turning point in terms of that relationship. And if the United States shows it's really got the will, it would be welcomed, you think, in many parts of the continent of Africa. But key to a lot of what you say is that at the heart of that relationship has got to be dignity, and there's got to be mutual respect. It is not for the United States to replace Europe by coming in and lecturing solely about human rights and democracy. They've got to show respect for the fact that a lot of African countries have very much their own traditions and culture, and that's got to be part of the mix.
Two things. I think, broadly speaking, the US has a very positive image in Africa. One. Secondly, as mentioned earlier, I think the US has started to distance itself from the former colonial powers. This is very little spoken of, but there is a very discrete transition. The US is now trying to replace, to a certain extent, the former colonial powers in Africa, because simply America is realizing the fact that the European powers can no longer handle Africa, as discussed earlier, because of the sheer power of Russia and China, economic power of China, military power of Russia. So the United States, although there is this positive trend in terms of improving and strengthening US-Africa relations, there are a lot of obstacles to be overcome to make this a real success. I mentioned misunderstanding. You mentioned lecturing African countries. Indeed, Africans are very frustrated by the fact that America tends to lecture countries, dictate its will, tell countries what to do. Again, from an American standpoint, from the standpoint of American way of life and values, regardless of those countries' historical background. So this has to change. There needs to be a change in the US mindset when it approaches Africa. But I can understand. The US loves to criticize itself, so it is susceptible to criticize other countries. But Africans do not understand this, particularly when they compare the US approach to the Chinese or Russian ones. Chinese and Russians come to Africa. If it's business of security, they just do business and security. They are not talking about democracy and human rights. The United States is putting conditions on almost everything, asking countries to comply with democratic rules, the rule of law, transparent elections, and the respect of human rights, etc. I think that has to change. America should understand that Africans have their own cultures and values. Everybody wants to develop democracy. The advent of democracy depends on a lot of factors. Every country goes to democracy at its own pace, based on its own realities, institutional capabilities, political will, historical context. So America has to understand that. Just be patient, I would say, to the United States. America was not made in a decade or not even in a century. So give time to African countries which literally have been in existence over the past 16 years. It's too early. People have to learn from their own experiences, from their own failures, from their successes, and grow from there. So lecturing is definitely one key problem. The other feature of the US mindset to change, to make this a real success, is the way Africa is perceived and depicted. Africa is very much seen as a burden. Let's go and help those poor Africans, diseases, coup d'etats, and poverty, you name it. In reality, Africa is not a burden. Africa is an opportunity for the United States for the reasons I mentioned: natural resources, growing population. Did you know that by some projections, by 2050, African population will reach 2 billion inhabitants, meaning 25% of world population? So, but a significant market for US businesses. So Africa is not a burden. Africa should be seen as an opportunity for the United States. I think the mindset, if it changes, taking into account the fact that the United States cannot lecture the entire world about what it has to do, and particularly doing it the American way, and also understanding that Africa is not a burden but an opportunity, then respect will be there. Then dignity will be there. And Africans, because of historical facts, are very sensitive to the notions of mutual respect and dignity.
So here is the key. Your fundamental argument is it's in America's self-interest to get involved, but because they have a good reputation by and large in Africa for not having gone in and exploited overly, this is a time when African countries will recognize the United States as a new interlocutor, as somebody who's got a fresh start, so that for Africa, as well as for the United States, it's a reset of relations globally, geopolitically and economically, where only perhaps the United States is in a position to do that.
Let me put it that way. In international relations, nothing is free, and generosity does not exist. The new generation of Africans prefer to speak the language of mutual interests. Mutual interests. International relations, relationships between states, it's not about generosity, friendship, or love. It's about defense of self-interests. That being said, what are the mutual interests tying the United States and African countries? Security is one. Just to elaborate on your point, saying it is in the interest of the United States. Indeed, it is in the interest of America as it is in the interest of the African country itself. So let me just mention a few common grounds and shared interests between the United States and Africa. I was saying security is one. Don't forget the bombing of U.S. embassies, I think in 1990, 2008 or something, like 200 or 300 people dead in Tanzania and in Kenya. Because America, the enemies of America may hit America in Africa, because America might be more vulnerable in Africa than in other places. Security is key. Security is key. In the world is now a village. If you do not have security in Africa, you may have a spillover effect. Immigration in Europe, immigration onto America, and it will become a world problem. So security is one. Earlier I mentioned economic and business potential between the US and Africa. Minerals, the population, the size of the African growing population, the growing middle class in Africa. 300 million people in Africa are characterized as middle class, meaning people with annual income of $4,000 and above. That's not bad. So you're talking about 20% of the African population. That's huge in terms of purchasing power of US products. And Africa also expecting US to invest in the continent. So economic and business interests after security, diplomatic ties. African countries represent 25 or exactly 28% of United Nations membership. That's significant. Just think of the UN vote on Ukraine war to condemn Russia. So Africans' votes were direly needed by the West and particularly by the United States. So how about technology? Africa needs US technology. So you have a number of common grounds between the United States and Africa, which explains the fact that it's not just out of generosity. It's not just talking about friendship. We're talking about hard state interests. It is in the interest of the United States to do business in Africa, to cooperate. I would not say to help, because it has some connotation of assistance, a giver and a taker, but to cooperate, collaborate in a win-win. It's very trendy to say that, in a win-win way. So it's in the interest of the United States as well as in the interest of Africa. Africa cannot simply ignore the strongest country in the world. I'm not even talking about the importance of the African diaspora in the United States. I'm not even talking about the importance of the American population of African descent.
Now, as you say, critically, America is a security provider, obviously. It can be there, it can play that role. Do you think that African countries, and one mustn't talk about Africa as though it's one continent, obviously, there's huge variety across the continent. But do you think there's a willingness there, if necessary, to have more direct US involvement in the whole security process? Or does that inevitably lead to more upset and contention if the Americans, because they have traditionally tended to go in very heavy-handedly. If we look at other parts of the world, that would not go down well in Africa.
Security, a key issue in US-Africa relations. Let me approach this in two ways. One, definitely Africa needs the United States for its own security. I'm talking about security of Africa. That being said, the practical modalities of US bringing security to Africa might be debatable for a very simple reason. So far, the impression Africans have, in the vast majority, is the US has had a very heavy-handed approach to security, thinking of it mainly in terms of military intervention. But security, the notion should be broadened to include other dimensions, social dimensions. Job creation. Idle people may be tempted by extremists. Education, very important. Governance also has a security dimension. When leaders are not providing essential services to the people, when leaders are not really leading in an effective way, the end result is grievances and instability in the countries. The point I'm trying to make here is that the notion of security should be understood. It's a very broad definition, not just from a strict military standpoint, but also to include other dimensions like education, job creation, and governance on the part of the African countries. So yes, Africa needs US security, but the modalities of implementing that security assistance can be improved.
And to what extent do you think greater American involvement in different parts of the continent would involve a degree of confrontation, you've mentioned them, with China and with Russia? Because it has the potential to offer even greater instability in some places.
Did you know, as we speak, that the United States has about 30 military bases in 15 African countries, what in the military jargon we call enduring and non-enduring, permanent, semi-permanent, and non-permanent bases, but very discreet. But America is there, already there. Massive presence, particularly in the Sahel region, from the Sahel to Somalia. So America is already there and massively present. So this issue is not debatable. You mentioned potential confrontation with Russia and China. Let me say that as a matter of policy, China usually does not send foreign troops overseas, usually. But they have a military base in Djibouti at Camp Lemonnier, where you have other powers also present. That's an exception. China used to send troops through the United Nations peacekeeping operations, not direct intervention. China's intervention in Africa is economic invasion, so to speak, not military invasion. That's for China. Speaking of Russia, indeed, Russia has significantly enhanced its presence, militarily speaking, in Africa through the Wagner mercenary group, as is the case in the Central African Republic. Some people are saying in Mali as well, and perhaps in Burkina Faso. Interestingly enough, there is a common thread. Those countries where Russia has sent mercenaries are almost all of them French-speaking. So it's very telling about the way people resent the French presence in those countries. So Russia is building up presence, military presence in Africa. Yeah. Because Russia is there, once again, the United States, as a global player, cannot ignore Russia's presence in Africa. But as I say, it's massive, but discreet. They are there. Confrontation, I don't think there might be any direct confrontation between the Russian troops and the United States troops. I don't think so, at least not in the foreseeable future. But the war, the competition is ongoing on all fronts: business, economic, diplomacy, and now military. And it's also telling about our very first point regarding the U.S. replacing Europe in Africa, because perhaps of the realization that former colonial powers from Europe can no longer face the competition by China and Russia. So the big brother, the American big brother, had to jump in directly and play and confront directly those superpowers, which is not at the reach of countries like France, definitely.
But it sounds interesting, as though you're talking about there is a sense of urgency about the necessity for the United States in particular to engage more thoroughly, more effectively, but more respectfully in terms of African countries right now, that there is an urgency about the process.
Once again, the answer is yes, but the modalities are questionable, debatable. For Africans, the United States should not see Africa just as a battlefield, a place where superpowers compete. The United States should also think of Africans, the people who live in Africa, not just as Africa, a continent where China and Russia are making inroads and the US has to go there to counter those competitors. Again, the practical modalities respect dignity for Africa. You have people living in Africa. They are called Africans. They have their expectations, their desires, their wants. Who is taking care of that? I would paraphrase somebody by saying, among world powers, Africa is almost always on the menu, but never at the table. So they need to heed the expectations and aspirations of the African people and not just use Africa as a battleground among big powers.
But do you think this is an urgent requirement? Because we have seen, as you say, benign neglect for decades now. There is apparently a shift in attitudes, a more positive approach coming from Washington. They recognize that now is the time to do something. Do you think now really is a good time because of that whole global shift in terms of relations between the old colonial powers and what is going on with the global powers like Russia and China? Now is the time to stop talking about it and get involved.
There is no reason to have doubt about the U.S. will to change course. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, toured this summer a number of African countries, including significant ones like South Africa. I mentioned a policy paper called the U.S. New Strategy for Engagement vis-à-vis Africa, issued in August. There is a clear will to change course and reinforce U.S.-Africa relationships. Once again, that was not done out of generosity. It's not coming out of the blue. I think the push by U.S. competitors in Africa called for a very strong but subtle response from the United States. And this policy paper is exactly the response. My reading is that America has understood what Africans are looking for, what they are expecting. So let's see what the future holds. Everything is in implementation. We have a vision, we have a policy paper. Let's see in the coming years how all this will be implemented. And by the way, the forthcoming US Africa Leaders Summit will tell us more about, what will be the next steps, concrete steps in the US-Africa relations.